But this morning, Merv, if you'd like to join me for a moment, if we can, maybe I'll come down here and you come on round. Give Merv a warm welcome. So you're going to kindly preach for us later, but I thought it'd be an opportunity while you're here to hear a little bit about the work of CSW. Now, people who found organisations like this that have an impact, there's always a founding story. There's that narrative that hooked you into this particular issue. Just in a few words, Merv, what was it that hooked you in and got you to this subject in particular?
Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's great to be with you all. We've got to go back to 1979, end of 78 actually, so 44 years ago. It's not very exciting actually. It wasn't. The start of it wasn't very... I was working for a friend of mine who was a Member of Parliament a couple of evenings a week. I lived in Essex and we used to drive up to London a couple of nights a week. And he was a Catholic, and he heard about Christian persecution in Eastern Europe. What was the old Soviet bloc? Those of you old enough to remember that back. But... And it was, he'd heard about Christians being persecuted, being put in prison, and there was one particular case actually called the Siberian Seven, and they were Pentecostalists. I happen to be Pentecostal, but please don't hold that against me. And they were two families who were trying to escape from Russia, and they fled into the American embassy. They were actually there for a number of years. And it was that story that particularly inspired my friend who was the Member of Parliament. He said, shall we set an organisation from Switzerland had come across and told some parliamentarians about this story. So he said, shall we set something up here? And you know, if I'm honest, Charlie, I only said yes because he was my mate, and I really didn't know much about it. But it wasn't long before when you go and visit the countries, and it was actually a few years later when I visited Romania, which was probably one of the worst of those countries with President Ceausescu, who was... Romania in those days was very similar to North Korea today, actually, except it didn't have nuclear weapons. It was run by a total despot. The first time I went there, I got arrested, so it was a great start. But no, so that's how we started anyway. It was looking at Christian persecution in Eastern Europe.
Great. And you're going to tell us a little bit more about that as you're preaching later. But one of the things that in a world that's polarising all the time, that's dividing people, that likes to set one group against another, the thing that really draws me to your work and your organisation is that actually you are standing up as distinctively as Christians for the rights of people of any faith to practice their religion. And I think that's a really important message in the world today. So what's a little bit behind that story?
Yeah, it really is an important part of what we do and an important part of the story. So when we started, as I said, it was just solely looking at Christian persecution in Eastern Europe. And then in 1989, 10 years after we started, communism fell throughout Europe. Some of you might remember that. And in fact, I've been this week in Prague, and they were remembering there the Prague Spring and when the Russian tanks came in. And all that. But 1989 in Prague, in Czech Republic as it is now, they had what they called the Velvet Revolution. But there were revolutions all over those countries, and suddenly Christians who'd been imprisoned, who'd been tortured, who'd been unable to worship freely, suddenly found themselves free. So the only information we had was on these Christians in Eastern Europe. So we thought, well, maybe the end of our work is, praise God, you know, we've been praying for freedom in Eastern Europe. It's happened. And I do, incidentally, believe that fall of communism throughout Europe, prayer played a huge part in that. I really believe that. But anyway, as we looked around, we realised there was a lot more persecution in the world. And probably about 10 years after that, one day, one of my staff members came and he said, and he'd just written a report, or she'd just written a report, actually, on Christian persecution in what was Burma, Myanmar. And she said, while I was there, she said, I feel quite challenged because while I was there, I came across a group of Muslims called the Rohingya. And many people today have heard of the Rohingya, but they hadn't then. And she said, they're just as badly persecuted the Christians. What should we do? And I knew instinctively what we should do, and I'm going to make a confession here now because I'm not very proud of what I did, but I said, yes, we will speak up for them, but we'll only do that when we're facing Parliament. We're an advocacy organisation, so we work in Parliament and Capitol Hill and places like that. So I said, yeah, we'll do it, but we won't tell our supporters we're doing it, because all our supporters probably were evangelical Christians, and I thought they're just not going to get this. They're going to suddenly going to lose all of our funding that we get, and that was a terrible reason not to. But I confess that today. But it was a few years later, and we'd been speaking up for the Rohingya and other groups, and I thought, I've got to tell everybody. I've got to educate the church, is really what I felt, because the church wasn't ready for it, actually, 20 years ago. And so I've got a good friend of mine in, Joel Edwards, who used to be the director of the Evangelical Alliance, and Joel came in and I said, take us through, what's the theology, what does the Bible say about this? And he did, and maybe I'll say a bit more about that later. But it was quite obvious to me we needed to be open. We rebranded slightly. We were called Christian Solidarity Worldwide. We just cut down to the letters. CSW. It still stands for Christian Solidarity Worldwide. But we did that because it sounded like we were Christian Solidarity. Sounds it's all Christians together, and it was more than that. But Charlie, it's really important for people to know that I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father. I'm not a syncretist, liberal Christian in any way. I am involved in lots of interreligious dialogues with other faiths, but I believe strongly. And what we do it out of the motivation of being Christians. And when we do it, it's actually missional when you speak up for people of other faiths. They say, well, why would you do that? And I always say, because Jesus would do that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Merv. We look forward to sharing with us. How can we pray for you and CSW?
Well, thank you. Please pray just for our continued effectiveness. Actually, we could pray. At the moment, we're going through, and I'm not coming asking for money, but we're going through a bit of a financial, as loads of charities are, problems. But pray for the financial situation of the organisation, but more importantly, pray because I believe God will provide. He's provided for us for 44 years. He's not going to stop now. But for the continued effectiveness, I think you should pray, please, for that. I stepped down as CEO, 2 years ago, and I've got a great job now. I can do whatever I like, and I don't have to bother about running the show. So that's really lovely. But I do feel that God's been preparing me for the last 40 years for this phase of my life, and I find myself in all kinds of political situations, whether that's places like Number 10 or the White House and places like that. Just God's opened up incredible doors. But just pray that they will continue and that we will... there is more awareness at a political level all around the world of religion, of freedom of religion or belief than there's ever been. But the situation is worse than it's ever been. Right. So pray that... But having said that, and I'll perhaps say a bit more later, but I've got more hope than I've ever had because of the awareness. But pray that awareness will turn into action for people to actually make a difference wherever they are.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Ian is going to come now and bring us today's reading. And then Merv, over to you.
The reading is Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 40. It's on page 1210 in the church Bibles, but I'm reading from the Living Bible translation. Well, how much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and all the other prophets. These people all trusted God, and as a result won battles, overthrew kingdoms, ruled their people well, and received what God had promised them. They were kept from harm in a den of lions and in a fiery furnace. Some, through their faith, escaped death by the sword. Some were made strong again after they had been weak or sick. Others were given great power in battle. They made whole armies turn and run away. And some women, through faith, received their loved ones back again from death. But others trusted God and were beaten to death, preferring to die rather than turn from God and be free, trusting that they would rise to a better life afterwards. Some were laughed at and their backs cut open with whips, and others were chained in dungeons. Some died by stoning, and some by being sawed in two. Others were promised freedom if they would renounce their faith, then were killed with the sword. Some went about in skins of sheep and goats, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in dens and caves. They were hungry and sick and ill-treated, too good for this world. And these men of faith, though they trusted God and won his approval, none of them received all that God had promised them. For God wanted them to wait and share the even better rewards that were prepared for us. Amen.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think this invitation's been a long while in the making, isn't it, Charlie? I think it came out of when Holly was running the Just Love group at Exeter University, and I went down and spoke. I'm not quite sure how that invitation came. Oh, Tabby Anderson? Yeah. Anyway, so went down to speak there, and it just so happened that Charlie and your wife were there as well that weekend, and through some bizarre circumstance we realised we had mutual friends in Julia Marina Speroni, and anyway, Charlie said come down and speak sometime, and that was how many years ago? But anyway, we're here now, so thank God. Thank you so much for inviting me. You know, the passage we just read is kind of a bit difficult to understand in some respects, because the whole chapter of Hebrews, chapter 11, is a chapter that talks about the heroes of the faith, basically, from the Old Testament. And if you read the first part of the chapter, you'll see examples with people's names and all of that. But this last few verses that we read just is more of a generalisation, and it talks about those people that were delivered from the edge of the sword. So I guess we're thinking about people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, who were delivered from death. And but then halfway, and talks about some amazing things that happened to people where God saved them, but they'd stood up to persecution, but God had saved them. But then it turns round in the second part of the chapter, the second part of the bit that we read, and it talks about others were not so lucky, if you like. That others were imprisoned, were tortured. It talks about people being, if you read the NIV version, it talks about people being sawn in two. It means beheaded. And you sort of think to yourself, well, were those people that were beheaded and those people that were tortured, didn't they have as much faith as those that were delivered? The answer is no, that's not the case, because it says at the end of the chapter that all of them were commended for their faith. So why some suffer, and some are delivered, I don't know. I have to ask Charlie, he's the pastor, he knows things like that. But you know, that case is exactly the same today. And throughout the world, I could be here for a week telling you stories of miraculous deliverances. I could be here a week telling you stories of terrible things happening to people that we can't understand. But we just have to, I parked that a bit this morning, but I tell you that just to paint the picture that persecution has been around forever. It's been around since the beginning of the world. It's been around, and particularly people have persecuted for their faith in God, and that carries on today. And to a degree, as Christians, we'll come on to other faiths later, but as Christians, to a degree, we have to recognise that actually we can expect to be persecuted. We are fortunate in this country and that we're not persecuted. And whenever I go to churches, one of the first questions I always get asked is, what about the persecution in England? Well, I'm sorry, but we haven't got persecution in this country yet. It could come. There's no doubt. There's lots of stories of discrimination. There are lots of stories of things that we don't like, but we are not being persecuted as a group. If we were being really persecuted, this church we would be worried about coming to church this morning. And none of you, I trust, were worried about coming for security reasons, coming to church this morning. But nevertheless, Jesus said, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. That's what he says in John 15, verse 18. And Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:12, he says, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Jesus, who wants to live a godly life in Jesus this morning? You know, there's a few people. The rest of you probably know what the rest of that verse says. It says, if you want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus, you will be persecuted. That is that's one of those promises that you don't find in the promise box. But we can expect it. It doesn't mean to say, though, that we don't challenge it, that we don't challenge the fact that we are persecuted. And as I say, we are not in this country anywhere near that as yet. But I think as somebody prayed, those figures, actually, the person who prayed this morning talked about 75% of the world. These figures are changing all the time. Now, according to Pew, which is an organisation which does figures on religious freedom, 84% of the world's population live in countries with high or very high restrictions on freedom of religion or belief. That's staggering, isn't it? That's most of the world live in countries. Doesn't mean to say every person in those countries experiences that, but that is the case. Sometimes that might come in the form of societal violence against religious minorities. Has anybody got any idea the country that has got the worst record for societal violence against religious minorities? India? Yes, who said that? Wow. India, yeah, and most people are staggered by that. But India, because particularly because the BJP are in power at the moment, the Hindu nationalists, they lead people, and it is a Hindu country. People believe that by attacking Christians and Muslims and Sikhs, they believe that they are being good Indians by doing that. And so, yes, that's got the worst record in the world. And then of course, you've got those that are persecuted by governments and countries like China or North Korea would come to mind when we're talking about it, or Iran. And then you've got those that have got a mixture of the two, that basically the societal violence and the government does nothing about it. And countries like Nigeria, which in my mind is the country that I'm most worried about at the moment, and maybe we'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But the amazing thing is, has anybody got any idea where the fastest, and you be quiet at the back because you obviously know these questions, Where is the fastest growing church in the world? What country? I heard both of them there. Yeah, Iran is the fastest growing church in the world, which is an Islamic theocracy. And that's staggering, isn't it? People coming to faith in God in Iran in amazing numbers. And you're right, China, somebody also said, China is probably the second fastest growing church in the world, and none of these figures are. You can't tell exactly. But China has possibly got something like 130 million Christians in a country that is, and persecution of not just Christians but of others in China is absolutely staggering, and it's got worse and worse and worse. Maybe 10 years ago, in fact before Xi Jinping, things were beginning to improve, and they've really gone backwards, and the situation in China is worse than it's ever been since the Cultural Revolution, according to people that are China watchers. And but you know, and more people, and I'm talking about Christians now, we'll come on to the others later, but more Christians were persecuted in the 20th century. I know we're well into the 21st now, but in the 20th century than all the other centuries combined. Okay? But I don't want this to all be doom and gloom, because there's a really good reason for that. And one of the good reasons is that the church is bigger than it's ever been before. Oh, I forgot I'm not in the Pentecostal church. Yes, that's it. The church is bigger than it's ever been before, praise God. And it's growing. Jesus Christ said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So, do you know, I know some figures. You know, I was in Nepal earlier this year. And do you know, in 1960, there were just 50 Christians in Nepal. Just 50. It's a Hindu country like India. And just 50 Christians in 1960. By 1990, that had grown to just 50,000. But nevertheless, that was great growth. When I was there earlier this year, well, in fact, I knew this before I went there, but I was asking, how big, there's churches everywhere. I said, how big is the church in Nepal today? And I was told between 2 and 3 million. Amazing. And I actually, and of course the 50 that were there in 1960 were teachers and nurses and doctors, Christians that had gone in to do their jobs, but to be missionaries. And I told those statistics in a church last year. I don't know where it was, somewhere in the UK. And afterwards, a little old lady came up to me and she said, I was one of the 50. Isn't that amazing? Praise God, what a legacy. And so often we don't see, do we, that the seeds that we've sown, we don't see how they grow. But that church is growing there. So, you know, we can expect more persecution in many respects because the church is growing and stronger than it's ever been. But, you know, I mentioned China, and that will bring me to just talk about the work that we do with people of other faiths. And in China, there are between 1 and 3 million Uyghur Muslims. Most of you will have heard of Uyghur Muslims because it's one of the few areas where there's been traction in the media. We put out press releases daily at CSW about things in different parts of the world, and very rarely do they get picked up by the secular media. They get picked up all the time by the religious media, but not by the secular. But the Uyghur Muslims have really gained great traction. And actually, it was CSW that broke the story of the Uyghur Muslims a few years ago. But there are up to 3 million of them in re-education camps. And they're there simply because they're Uyghur Muslims. And they are... The Chinese Communist Party says that they're there. They should be thankful they're there because they're getting education that they wouldn't get. Well, they certainly are getting education that they wouldn't get there. But of course, when we go to school or when we go to university or we go to get educated, we're allowed to go home at night. They're not allowed to go home at night. And not only that, There are many reports of Uyghur women being sterilised in the camps in order to stop the growth of the Uyghur population there in China. Also, the church in China, although it's growing, is very badly persecuted. And even in the official church now, there are still 5 groups of people who are forbidden to attend an official church. So Chinese Communist Party will say, yeah, everything's free, we've got official churches, people can go to it, but they can't. If you are a member of the Communist Party, you can't attend church. If you are a member of the armed forces, you can't attend church. If you are a government employee in any way, you can't attend church. If you are a university student, you can't attend church. And if you're a minor under the age of 18, you can't attend church. All of those groups are forbidden. So how do they police that? Well, they police that by having face recognition cameras around churches. The Chinese Communist Party, if this was in China today, as you'd come in the gates of the church, there would be cameras. So nobody could get into the church grounds without a camera picking them up. And there would be, in this auditorium, in this sanctuary, there would be cameras all around, put up by the Chinese Communist Party, and they would recognise your face, and they check that against identity card photographs, so they know who you are. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in those groups who comes to church are always picked up by the police, but many of them will be. So the situation in China is really, really bad. It's a job to know. Let me say, as I mentioned earlier, we're an advocacy organisation. So the Word of God tells us in Proverbs 31 that we're to speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. I'm just paraphrasing what it says, but that's our guiding light at CSW. And it doesn't say speak up for Christians. It doesn't say speak up for God's covenant people. It says speak up for those unable to speak, whoever they are. And when we looked into why we should be doing what we're doing with all faiths, that was one of the verses that we looked at. Some people use Galatians 6 verse 10 that says, do good to all, but especially to the household of faith or household of believers. And that's great, there's nothing wrong with that, but they just pick the second part of the verse and say that we should only be speaking up for the household of believers. It says in the beginning, do good to all. And when the man came to Jesus and said, who's my neighbour? Jesus said, and he was hoping that Jesus was going to give him a list of 6 people he could tick off. They used to like doing their tickings off, didn't they, the Pharisees? But Jesus said, no, the world is your neighbour. But then he picked out especially a group of people that the Jews hated. And hated them. So, it really, if 2 people walked in this door this morning, one was a Christian and one was a Muslim, and they were both hungry, and you only had enough food for one, you wouldn't give it. In fact, you'd probably give it to the Muslim rather than the Christian, but you'd break it in half. But you'd feed both of them, wouldn't you? We have to. It's what the Bible tells us to do, and it's what as Christians is the human thing to do. We're all made in the image of God, but also we have to recognise as Christians, we have to recognise that God gave everybody a free will to choose. Not everybody chooses to be Christians. And some people are persecuted in the world today because they're atheists. So the work that we do, and the work that we do, as I said earlier, we're advocacy. We don't do aid. We don't get involved in things like delivering Bibles or anything like that. What we do is we speak up in the places of power. And I've just been in Prague all week at a conference, and it's a ministerial conference. At ministerial level, 80 foreign ministers from around the world coming together to talk about what we call freedom of religion or belief. So that includes atheists and humanists. But we believe that everybody should be free to practice their religion or belief, or no belief at all. So that's really, really important. But we do those things at that kind of level. And I haven't got time to go into that this morning, but it's really important that there are voices speaking up about this. When I started, we talked earlier when Charlie asked me And I said that I started it with a friend of mine who was an MP. Well, we tried to find other MPs that were interested, and there were three. There were four MPs. One of them was him. One of them was a very young MP called David Alton, and most of you will have heard of Lord Alton today. He's still speaking up on those issues. One of them was David Amis, who was assassinated a couple of years ago in Southend-on-Sea. A very dear friend of mine. We travelled to different countries together. And the other one, funnily enough, because in fact, David Amis and David Atkinson, the guy who started it, were Catholics. But the third person that joined us was an Ulster Unionist who was at the time the Grand Master of the World Orange Order, called the Reverend Martin Smith. So you can tell that we never discussed theology. Otherwise, CSW wouldn't be here today. But we concentrated on what we felt we should do together as Christians, which was to speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. And as we speak, I want to tell you that there are today in our Parliament 170 members of the all-party parliamentary group of freedom of religion or belief, out of just those 3 or 4 who were interested at the time now. And they're people of all faiths, but probably the majority Christians. But 170. There is widespread awareness around the world. This conference I was in Prague this week, this is the 4th one. There have been 2 in America. We had one here in the UK last year. We had 1,000 people from around the world coming to talk about freedom of religion or belief. It's really, really important that we speak up for them, that all of us speak up for them. And before I finish, in a bit, I will explain how you can speak up for them too, because we all need to. I want to just talk about another couple of countries very briefly. One is Nigeria. I mentioned earlier that Nigeria is probably the country that I'm most concerned about. It's also probably the country where there is most violence. We talked about India, but on a daily basis, Christians in particular are being killed in Nigeria. And these come from 2 or 3 sources. There are 3 terror groups operating in. So basically, Nigeria is half Christian and half Muslim, roughly. And the Christians mainly live in the south, the Muslims mainly live in the north. But there is a strong, vibrant church in the north, despite the fact that they're in very much a minority. And the central belt, where there's much more of a mix. It's in those areas where the terror groups are operating. And there's a group called the Fulani herdsmen, who are, and it's now the Fulani militia, who have been armed with. All of these groups are armed with modern weaponry, AK-47 rifles, and even missiles. Fulani militia who go around the Christian farming villages and attack whole villages at a time. They also kidnap Christians constantly on the roads in Nigeria. And then you've got the Boko Haram, who is a group that operates, and there's been a couple of you, I'm sure, would have heard of the Chibok girls that were kidnapped a few years ago, and also another group of girls taken from a school in Dapchi. And there's a particularly poignant story of a girl called Leah Sharibu. So 110 girls were taken. This was by the group which is now the 3rd group, which is ISWAP, which is the Islamic State of West Africa province, which is operating in Nigeria and Chad as well. And they took 110 girls, and the government negotiated immediately their release. And so it shows it can be done, incidentally. And they let all of them go apart from one girl called Leah Sharibu. And they didn't let go because she was a Christian. The others were all Muslims. And they said she could be set free with them. She could go home with the rest, provided she converted to Islam before she went. And this 14-year-old girl refused to convert. And she said, I'm a Christian. And she is still in camp today. That was, I think she's in her 5th year now, She's been married off to the chief of the terrorists, has 2 children with them, but she's maintained her faith. And please pray for Leah Sharibu, 14 years old. Do you know what you'd have done if you'd have been asked to make the decision to see us? Because I don't know what I would have done. I hope I would have done the same as her, but none of us know, do we, until we're in that situation. And so the situation in Nigeria is horrendous. And it really is the most dangerous place that I go. Let me just tell you, because, you know, a few years ago, I've got a 23-year-old son, and when he was 17, he was at school down in Bath, a Christian school called Monkton Combe, and but Seth, my son, had constantly said to me, "Dad, can I come on a trip with you?" He'd always wanted to come on a CSW trip, and so he said, "I've got 2 weeks off at half term, and can I come with you? Are you going anywhere in this half term?" It was this time of the year, it was October time, and I said, "Well, I'm going to Nigeria." So he said, "Well, oh, great, I'll come." So I said, "Well, hang on a minute." So he said, "Yeah, please, will you pay for me to come?" I said, "Yeah, I'll pay for you, but not the organisation, obviously. But yes, I will." But then I was in Iraq about a month before, and one of my oldest friends, who's an American congressman, said to me, "Merv, please don't take Seth to Nigeria." He said, "It's the most dangerous place I ever go." I said, "I know, it is me too." He said, "Please don't take him." And I went home and I thought, I'm going to have to tell Seth he can't go. And because it's the last thing Frank Wolf said to me before I left Iraq. "Don't let him go, will you?" Anyway, when I got home, he said, Dad, don't worry, I've had all these words being given me about courage and verses from the Bible, so I'm going. My wife really didn't want him to go. It's funny because she never minds me going, but anyway. So we went, and what happened next was not part of our plan. We went on the most dangerous road in Nigeria, which is from Abuja to Kaduna. Kidnappings and killings happen on it almost daily. So a horrendous road, but we decided we wanted to go and visit a village where 30 Christians had been killed a few weeks before while they were in church. And we just wanted to go to be with them, to tell them we cared for them, to pray for them, and to say that we would tell their stories. And we went up to this village. I won't tell you the bit about us being actually kidnapped on the way by a terror group, but it only lasted for about 2 hours. But somebody put it on the WhatsApp group, and my wife was extremely worried. But anyway... But we got to the village, and we went into the sort of village hall, which was probably about the size of this church, and they told us their stories, and so they were farmers, and they not only have these 33 been killed in church, but they'd had regular killings as people. They couldn't go out into the fields to farm anymore because they were being killed. And they brought in so they was beginning to starve because they couldn't grow their food, and they brought in a young 15-year-old boy into the village hall, and he'd got a bullet in his leg, and it had been there for 3 months, and the stench was awful because it was going gangrenous, and he'd laid in a ditch after he'd been shot, pretending to be dead, waiting for the terrorists to go, and then he got back to the village. And as we left the village, as we were driving, and there were 4 of us in the car, my son and I in the back, and the head of a big denomination in Nigeria in the front with the driver. And my son said to the guy, and the leader of the denomination, he said, "Why couldn't that boy," he's 2 years younger than me, he said, "why couldn't that boy get his leg treated?" And he said, "Well, there's no hospitals for miles around, and even if he'd have got to a hospital, he wouldn't have been able to afford the treatment." Incidentally, we did get the boy treated. So my son said, naively, as a 17-year-old boy, he said, "Well, why doesn't someone build a hospital here then?" And the guy said, well, if somebody could raise the money to do it, my denomination would run the hospital. And so my son said, well, how much would it cost? And I'm thinking, I'm knowing where this is going. And the guy said, oh, I'll make it. And he made a couple of phone calls, and he said £50,000 to build a small clinic with an operating theatre, with accommodation for doctors, and all this blah, 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 50,000. So my son said, OK, I'll raise it, start the work. And I'm saying, Seth! I'm thinking of my reputation, terribly. Seth, you can never raise £50,000. Do you know what that means? So he said, Dad, I know I can't raise £50,000. He said, but God can provide it. And God did provide it. A year later, we went back to the hospital, which they named after him, and we opened that hospital, which is still running today and caring for people. So we can make a difference. Whoever we are, we can make a difference. But I wanted to talk about more than that. I wasn't going to say that. I don't know why I told that story. But there are things that we can do, and I need to wrap up. But because I could have told you so many other stories of things that are happening in the world today. So many other countries, like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Pakistan. Horrific in Pakistan for both Christians and Hindus. I could have talked about Indonesia. I could have talked about Nepal. I mentioned Nepal. There's just so many places I could have talked about. And we can feel helpless, can't we? When I speak at churches, people say to me, I had no idea that these things were happening in the world. And I've only touched the surface. But there are things that we can do. And I would hasten to say, there are things that once we know, we should be doing. Not that we could do, but that we should. So what could we do? In 1 John 3 verse 18 it says, Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. So what can you and I do about some of the things that we've heard about? What can we do about what's happening in Nigeria? What can we do about what's happening in China? For both Christians and other faiths? Well, the first thing we can do is pray. Prayer is the most important thing that we do at CSW and is the most important thing we can do. I constantly come across people who have got the most amazing answers to prayer. And we see God move in situations which are staggering. And I remember a few years ago a man in Iran who had been sentenced to death for apostasy, a pastor, been sentenced to death for apostasy. And we called, and we knew he was going to, he refused, they gave him the chance to recant his faith several times in the Supreme Court. And when his case was cut, this final appeal was coming to court. Well, first of all, we'd mobilise our supporters to send emails to the Iranian embassy in London. And but then on the day that he was due to be sentenced, the day before, we called 24 hours of prayer around the world. And on the morning that he was going to court case, I always remember it, I had a phone call, it was about 7 o'clock in the morning from one of my staff that said, Pastor Nadakani has been released. He's been set free. All charges have been dropped. That is an answer to prayer. But it's also in response to a protest because people had been protesting. People had been sending emails. People had been... So we can pray, but we can protest too. And we should protest. Speak up, it says, for those unable to speak for themselves. Speak up. And if you go onto our website at CSW, and in fact I've got lots of literature there you can take away with you today in the other room. But if you go onto our website, you'll find we make it very easy for you to email your MP about things or to email ambassadors or whatever. We make it very, very easy for you to do. And they do make a difference. I haven't got time to tell you examples, but many, many, many examples. It makes a difference. So please pray, please protest. You can provide. One of the ways that you can provide, apart from financially, one of the ways you can provide is by writing letters and cards to people in prison. Very simple thing to do. Or those that are speaking. So, I speak up for people in this country who are persecuted, but It's easy. I don't get in any trouble for it. But in their countries, we've got people speaking up in their own countries. They're in a lot of danger. So we've got out there on the table, I've got some booklets called Connect and Encourage. And basically, they are an address book. So you can write, Christmas time is a great time. Get on it straight away. Write them a letter and card saying, I'm praying for you. Even if they're people of another faith, you can still say they're praying for you. If you're Christians, you can send them a Bible verse or whatever. It makes a difference. This week in Prague, I met a Vietnamese lawyer who had been sentenced to 11 years in prison. And he'd just been set free about 3 weeks ago. And he came to me and he said, I just want to thank you. Please thank all of your supporters. I got so many cards in prison. It was not just an encouragement to me, and he's a Buddhist, but he was helping Christians he was a Buddhist lawyer helping Christians who were in trouble. And he said, it wasn't only an encouragement to me, those cards were an encouragement to everybody in the prison. So we can pray, we can protest, we can provide, and the fourth thing we can do is proclaim. We can tell other people. Because, if we remain silent when we know what's happening, we are complicit in what's happening. We really are. If we do nothing, we're complicit in what's happening, because it's a duty on us as Christians, and it should touch our hearts that we want to do. I want to finish by reading one very quick thing that's just disappeared off my screen. Here it is. So it'll take me 2 minutes. A pastor, this is written by a pastor in his old age, but he had been a young boy in a church in Germany, in Nazi Germany. And this is what he says. A railroad track ran behind our small church, and each Sunday morning we could hear the whistle in the distance, and then the wheels coming over the tracks. We became disturbed when we heard the cries coming from the train as it passed by. We realised that it was carrying Jews like cattle in the cars. Week after week, the whistle would blow. We dreaded to hear the sound of those wheels because we knew that we'd also hear the cries of the Jews en route to death camp. Their screams tormented us. We knew the time the train was coming each week, and when we heard the whistle blow, we began singing hymns. By the time the train came past our church, we were singing at the tops of our voices. And if we heard the screams, we just sang more loudly. And soon we heard them no more. Although the years have passed, I still hear the train whistle in my sleep. God forgive me. Forgive all of us who called ourselves Christians and yet did nothing to intervene. Let's pray that as Christians we do something to intervene when we know what's happening in the world around us. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Merv. That was appropriately challenging. Almost feels inappropriate to sing, doesn't it, after that illustration? But we are going to sing, Bring Heaven to Earth, Lord. Bring peace where there's fear. It seemed appropriate. Let's stand and finish our service with this song.